Hello, everyone, and welcome to our second roundtable of the day, Bombay Film Color in the Archive. In this roundtable discussion, we want to reconsider the particular challenges that attend archival work on Bombay Film Color and to ask why the archive appears to have been so silent on questions of color. Similar to the panel on transnational networks, we have asked each of our participants to bring an object to share their experiences of working with around Bombay Film Archives before we open up the conversation between ourselves and the audience. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to introduce our participants for this panel. Our first speaker, Rosie Thomas, is a pioneer of the academic study of popular Indian cinema, establishing an international reputation following the publication of her first groundbreaking article on Hindi cinema in screen in 1985. Since then, she has written widely on Indian cinema, contributing to numerous books and journals, including her monograph, Bombay Before Bollywood, Film City Fantasies, published in 2013. She is also the co-founder and co-editor of the journal Bioscope, South Asian Screen Studies. Originally trained as a social anthropologist, Rosie first did her fieldwork in the Bombay film industry in the early 1980s. She has also worked as an independent documentary television producer, running her own company, Hindi Picture, in the 1980s and 90s, where she also made films for UK's Channel 4 television on a range of subject matters from health, mental health issues, to South Asian politics, art, and culture. Our second speaker, Ritika Kaushik, is a film historian and video essayist with a specialization in documentary cinema and the South Asian cinema. She's assistant professor of film and television studies at the University of Warwick. Her academic and videographic research focuses on the history, aesthetics, infrastructures, archives, and afterlives of state-sponsored documentary in India. Her writings have appeared in Bioscope, Economic and Political Weekly, Accidental Archivism, and Docalog. Her practice-based research is rooted in her training and experiences in filmmaking, which, in addition to her own projects, include her work as assistant director on a major Bollywood feature film. Her videographic work has been featured at the Pesaro Film Festival's Rimontaghi competition, the journals Nexus, and Techmarin, and is forthcoming in an online publication by the Lord Z Film School. Our final and third speaker of the day, Manishita Dass, is a reader in film and global media at Royal Holloway, University of London. Her research explores the intersections of film, visual, literary, performance, and leftist political cultures in South Asia. Her publications include Cloud Cab Star and Outside the Lettered City, Cinema, Modernity, and the Public Sphere in Late Colonial India. She has also written for Cinema Journal, Screen, Positions, and other edited collections. Between 2007 and 2010, she was one of the principal project coordinators of Tasveer Ghar, House of Pictures, a multi-institutional and transnational initiative for creating a virtual archive of South Asian popular visual culture through collecting, digitizing, and contextualizing a wide variety of images and visual artifacts, including posters, photographs, cinema advertisements, calendar art, and other forms of street art. And finally, I'm the moderator, Poorvi. I'm pursuing my PhD in film studies at Queen Mary University of London, and I'm interested in state-sponsored documentaries, feminist media histories, and South Asian cinema. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it on to our first speaker, Rosie.
Okay, so what I'm presenting are just a few observations, thoughts for directions of future research, and I'm one of the people that when I was asked to talk about Bombay colour, I said, well, I know about Bombay cinema, but I have never thought much about colour. But anyway, this has got me thinking in a very interesting way. And the first observation is that in all this talk of Eastman colour, Technicolor, Geva colour. There's one major emission re Bombay, and that is Bora colour. And the Bora colour is the hand colouring of the early films that went on until into the 1950s, well after printing of printed colour had come in. And it was done by the people from the community of the Boras, Gujarati Muslims. I know very little about them, but I found a few documentations. They were paid 4 annas a foot for 16 frames to do the, and often it would be just a song sequence or a dream that was hand-coloured. I don't know what happened in the silent era, and I'm sure the project is already trying to find that out, but certainly in the 40s and 50s and possibly later. And certainly in a jokey way, the term was being used in the 1980s when I was hanging around. So what I fundamentally want to bring into this conversation and this wonderful project is the whole issue of hand colouring in the Bombay film industry. It's absolutely ripe for research. Like all colour, it hides in plain sight. And I think what we can think is not just the films that had reels or possibly more hand-coloured, but we also have to think about the publicity materials, the stills, the lobby cards, the booklets, the postcards, and of course the posters, which quite a lot has been already written about. So my archival object is a sort of meta-object, has several layers, as we were strictly restricted to one image. So I followed the rules. So this will be familiar to some of you from the cover of my book, but you probably don't know its history. When I was doing my fieldwork in 1980, a friend of mine who was at the time doing his MA in photography at PCL came to join me for a couple of months, and for his final project he took black and white images of the film industry, the different sets that I went on, different things that, television with a film screening on it in the corner of a room, an office in Film City, so quite a lot of different kinds of images. And then we had the interesting idea of why not take it to these hand colorists that were working, as far as I know, in every graphic design office, or certainly there were enough of them working then. And he gave them, I've had a chat with him last week. He can't remember, I can't remember who did it. Neither of us has any records. I think it might have been someone in-house at Basant Studio, but I don't know. I know the date it was taken, 12th of March 1980. But crucially, he gave them absolutely no instructions. They were so familiar, they had their genre conventions. This was Raja Sultan, Hema Malini on the set, much later Kamal Amrohi film, and the people doing the hand colouring would have no idea of what she was wearing or what the colour was. So everything was their invention, and I think it's very interesting actually how they know how to make that image work in colour, and they're not constrained by what colour she was actually wearing or anything. The other observation that he's made is that they were incredibly stable colours. So still today, and he has the originals, they haven't lost a lot of their colour. So we've no idea what exactly they used, but clearly it was a very professional outfit that had its own rules and was very, very well established. And so that kind of led me to thinking more about, what sort of questions does it raise? Certainly in the 1980s, a lot of films, even if they were shot in colour, the stills on set, the publicity stills, were taken in black and white and then hand-coloured afterwards. From my notes, I can see conversations about there being hierarchies of stills photographers. So the people that shot in what was referred to as direct colour tended to be more upper class and obviously wealthier. And the ones who worked in black and white were definitely of a lower class, but clearly got about much more. And so a lot of the films, even if shot in colour, had the stills presented in black and white. I found a conversation with Mittel, who did the main publicity, organised publicity in the 1980s of the films, and he said, well, you can have direct colour, or for half the price, we can have them hand-coloured. So it was clearly on the B&C circuits, those were all hand-coloured. On the A circuits, we assumed that it was a mix, and certainly I remember in lobbies in the 80s, seeing a lot of hand-coloured stills. Very interestingly, I found some stills from Jungli. The stills, and I've got them with me if anyone wants to see, the stills were clearly taken in black and white and hand-coloured. And this is a film that made its name on being shot in Eastman colour. So I think there's something interesting going on there that needs more research. There's also the thing, people were still shooting. I think it was something like only 50% of films shot in 1969 were in colour. So studios like the Wadia studio, which was doing the lower grade, B&C grade films, were shooting in black and white, mostly. Homi Wadia did a few, 3 or 4 in colour, but then most of his action or fantasy films were shot in black and white, but all the publicity was in colour. So like the poorer audiences were kind of fooled. I remember being very shocked when I went to see one of those films, because I'd seen all this colour publicity and it was in black and white. So I'm probably running a bit out of time. I think there are just questions about why was Jungli, which clearly had a lot of money, why was it shooting in black and white for its stills? And why I was sent these stills in the 1980s or 90s. So at that time, they were photographing the hand-coloured stills. Why? Was that a kind of nostalgia thing, aesthetic choice? They just didn't have any colour stills. I don't know. And of course the crossover between the stills and the lobby cards, which were basically collages of the black and white stills images, which were then hand-painted, is kind of interesting. And then we just come back finally to what were the genre conventions. Certainly the very red lips of the heroines, or all the women is very noticeable. The kinds of greens and blues that they use for the background scenes recurs in all these images. But I think, there's just a lot more questions, and it needs a PhD student to really get to grips with this before it's all lost, because there's a lot of material almost there. But the next stage of your project, we need someone to actually look at that before it's lost. So I'll leave that at that point.
Thank you, Rosie. Next we have Ritika.
Okay. Let's see. Hi, everyone. So I have more than one image. I did not know that rule. I'm claiming innocence. But to shift gears, I think, from, analog shot still images and analog film in general to colorizing by AI, I want to kind of explore that a little bit because a few years ago I got interested in the afterlife of this government film, I Am 20, that you see on the left on the YouTube page of India's primary state institution of documentary and short films, Films Division of India. This film was made in 1967 by an experimental filmmaker, S.N.S. Shastri, who was an employee at the Films Division of India. And the film was commissioned on the 20th anniversary of India's independence and interviewed people who had just turned 20. And it speaks to their disillusionments and their desires and just general observations about the state of the nation. So made at a time of intense experimentation within Films Division, it's one of the most well-known and important films that has emerged from this archive, and also a very interesting one. But curiously, it's a rare film that has found itself in multiple viral moments on social media. After its digitization and uploading on the FD's YouTube channel. A very bad upload, by the way, which the logo kind of keeps moving around because of the motion control and everything. But a couple of years ago, because this, was a popular video online, and I say video now because of the digital video, a YouTube channel, India in Pixels, by Ashrish, made Indians from 1967 talk about the future by re-editing I Am 20 and cutting it down to a shorter version, more focused on the interviews. So basically, he takes away all the experimental bits from the film and makes it a talking head documentary. And it was immensely popular. The video really circulated everywhere. And so he puts in inserts of the questions that we think the filmmaker is asking, or that he thinks the filmmaker is asking. And in the reviews of his video, one of the comments said, that the people in the film look like they are in costume, and that it was actually shot in the present time. So someone else said that if the video was in color, no one could actually tell it is from 1967. So what he does is he uses AI to colorize the video that he re-edited. Could we go to slide 3? I want to show the video. This is from his film, Where Are They Now? Video, Where Are They Now? Where he actually reconstructs the research that was done by another journalist of finding the people who were in the original film. So, he's able to kind of then juxtapose their images with the people who are in the film. Only some of them could be tracked. But I want to show you just like the tone in which, the AI process happens. Oh, there's no sound? Oh, it's fine. I just wanted to show you the reviews. So, and it's a documentary, so it looks like acting, dressing like the 60s. If it was in color through a software, you cannot find the difference from the past. So, this is the algorithm he makes to colorize it, which apparently took him 6 hours to do. And then this is the final result. And he says something very interesting there, that he says something like how it seems like these are the people you would go to college with, or these are the people who would be right next to you. So there's a way in which the film has been called this time capsule, that people who are watching them now are not really watching them for the people from 1967. They're watching them as people who are there now. So, and I think that's why the whole thing about where are they now speaks to that. So I think could you change the next slide? And next. Yeah, so I think the preference for colorized material speaks to an increasing lack of dissatisfaction or lack of satisfaction with black and white, which is somehow seen to belong to like this static and distant past. And for the vlogger India in Pixels, the simulation of color is perceived as more authentic and more real than the original black and white film. So it points us to, as scholars would think, that two different modes of realism. A perceptual realism that corresponds to what we think the world is like, and the indexical realism that has to do with the integrity of the process, which only admits those aspects that are included in the original capture, as archivists would think of. So color here is a produced condition rather than something that is captured. And I think that speaks to, Rosie, your point too, that why was a film that stills shot in black and white and how they're being colored in the stills in the lobby cards. So for me, this raises a question about the ideas of history and progress and what these material histories then can tell us about the past or the present. What does this appropriation and eventual colorizing, made possible due to increased access to state archives, mean in terms of the shifts in our understanding of color from the realms of ontology to phenomenology? And what happens after the object leaves the archive? Like, how do we imagine the archival afterlives of these films when they are freely available for people to do something with? Because when these objects in monochrome are available to people, what they want to do with it is that they want to colorize it. In order to recover the sense of immediacy in the original context, the users of such archival artifacts feel the need to doctor the image. This applies to IM20, as it is less a film about what the film is from or what the people is telling us about the people that it films or about the filmmakers or about that time in history, but more about what it tells us about the people now. And to me, this also ties to the longer context of archival afterlives, as the filmmaker, Shastri himself, was a remix artist and worked a lot with archival footage that he found in the Films Division archive, which was free to use for him, where, interestingly, and if we could move to the last slide, he would use footage from shot in color, printed to black and white in some of the later films. So, I mean, it's a bad screen grab, and there are many such instances. I could only find this one yesterday. But, where this kind of interesting backward turn is also kind of interesting for us, that black and white is not necessarily more authentic in that technical sense either, because we might not even know in what stock it was originally shot in. So going back to the vlogger and AI coloring, what I want to leave us here is, how do we deal with these Indians in 1967, now in color, rather than just as Indians from 1967 as they were captured on film? Thank you.
We now have Manishita.
I have more than one image too, and I can't claim innocence of the rules. I think I was channeling a bit of the anarchic spirit of the city in which I grew up. Although, but rest assured, I'll keep my comments brief, and there's a rationale for why I have more than one image. I'd like to thank Ranjini, Kirsty, and Poorvi for inviting me. I do feel like an interloper, as Lalita also said, because I haven't really worked on color, but as with most scholars working on pre-1950s Indian cinemas and film cultures, negotiating archival absence, the paucity of surviving films, the challenge of writing film history without films that Kirsty and Poorvi talk about in their brilliant essay, has been quite central to my research. So initially I thought I would talk kind of generally about that, about how absence has been a generative force and how it's prompted many of us to look past the screen and to cultivate a more flexible, imaginative, speculative relationship with archives than the one we might have started with. But the prompt for the panel actually reminded me about how I had encountered color while doing archival research for my first book, Outside the Lettered City, which looks at cinema's role as a public sphere and a mass medium of modernity in late colonial India, when black and white films were the norm. So thank you for the prompt, because it reminded me of the numerous archival objects I had accumulated during that time, even though I didn't use most of them in my book. And my archival object have to do with that encounter. So I encountered color in sort of sensuous fragments of a paper culture, in the vibrant images of posters, the publicity material that you mentioned, Rosie, on the covers of promotional booklets, or song booklets as they were called, in the pages of film periodicals, collections of movie memorabilia, and in lobby cards. So just a few images to give you a sense of what that encounter was like. So on the left is the image of a poster of the 1934 black and white film Indira M.A., starring Sulochana as in the title role of Indira, who is apparently has a master's from Oxford, is a staunch feminist, and is introduced in the film booklet as a free bard of paradise of civilized India. So it wasn't uncommon it was actually very common for solo shots of a film's female lead to be showcased in publicity materials from this period. So images of female film stars from the 1920s onwards featured prominently in posters, in lobby cards, magazine covers, advertisements, promotional material for cosmetics, textiles, chocolates, apparently. So this was part of the allure of cinema, and color and red lips, quite centrally, were central to the production of this allure and the production of female stardom. The image on the right is a cover image of a song booklet for Footpath, a film from a black and white film again, from 1953, which is sort of a leftist morality tale about a young writer played by Dilip Kumar who becomes a black marketeer. And this has nothing to do with color, but, and some of you might already know it, it also features Ramesh Thapar, the founder editor of Seminar, in one of the leading supporting roles in the film. So as many of you already know, film booklets were originally intended for the press, for theater owners, but later, with the inclusion of song lyrics, were sold as souvenirs for audiences and became a central, much-loved part of the movie-going experience, and much later would come to constitute an important paratextual archive for historians like me. And they often had color images on the cover, as in this one, and sometimes inside. So it's sort of an illustrated book showcasing a montage of attractions from the film: song, lyrics, dances, stardom. And again, color was quite central to the booklet's reimagination of the cinematic spectacle and its attractions. Can we move to the second slide, please? So on the left side is a black and white publicity photograph for Raj Nartaki, or the court dancer, which a much hyped 1941 trilingual film produced by Jamshed Wadia, starring Shadhana Bose, who was known for her dancing skills, and Prithviraj Kapoor. And on the right, you see a reimagination in color of the same scene. This one appeared on the cover of the 1941 Screen World Annual, which was published from Lahore, and also in a few other film periodicals that year. And these kind of publicity photographs, which you might also see in lobby cards in the movie theaters, were often not documentary images per se, but they were carefully rehearsed and staged tableaus from the film, showcasing dominant moments, promised pleasures from the film. And this kind of publicity material, the booklets, the lobby cards, etc., were not only used to sell films and attract viewers, but they also extended the power of the cinematic image beyond the screen, beyond the movie theaters, into everyday life. And I think that's something that Ranjini also talks about in her work on posters. So the point I want to make is that even when films were mainly black and white in the 1920s, from the 1920s to the 1950s, the visual pleasure of color was very much part of the everyday experience of cinema, the chromatic experience of cinema. if you will, and it sort of extended beyond screenings and visits to the movie theaters, to the streets, and to daily life, in part thanks to the kind of publicity material that I've been talking about. And finally, the final point I want to make is that there was a vibrant indigenous circuit of printmaking, graphic design, commercial art, commercial image making, both within and outside art schools, that were obviously already quite prominent in the book and periodical press by the end of the 19th century, but it kind of spilled into product advertising and into new forms of publicities, including the production of publicity materials for films. So I just want to end with a few very basic questions. So what kind of aesthetic, intermedial, cultural, industrial histories of Bombay color might emerge if we look at a wide range of this publicity material, and quite a fair bit of it has survived, although in a very dispersed manner. So what happens if we try to look at this material, publicity material, and try to locate these in the circuit that I just mentioned in the context of spectatorial experiences, and in relation to the pictorial traditions and representational idioms, idioms local and transnational, that were made visible in the visual cultural references across this range of publicity material, and I could talk more about that later. So the broader question is that what might we learn about the history of Bombay film color? What might happen to the periodization of color in relation to Bombay cinema, or in the Indian context more broadly, if we are not pursuing close textual analysis of films, but if we look beyond the screen and beyond color films. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosie, Ritika, Manishita. I'm just going to grab a seat. And I know we all have a lot of questions, so I'm just going to ask a question each from the three of you, and then we can open it up to the audience. And I think in some ways we did not visualize it then, but this panel came along together really wonderfully in the ways that the three objects sort of engage with each other and speak to each other, right? And so the first question would be to ask Ritika and Rosie to reflect on, so to say, what were the stakes of sort of coloring, hand painting, and in that process, rethinking or sort of recovering Bombay film color then, vis-a-vis recolorizing or AI colorizing now, and then rethinking or recovering the archive now.
Yeah, I mean, there's clearly a very good link, which I think Kartik is talking about and writing about as well at the moment. Kartik Nair, the labour of the digitisation is very like the borers who were doing these meticulous hand colourings. So there's, things. The more they change, the more they stay the same. I think it's mostly about. For me, there are two issues for me. One is what is the labour of that, and how does that labour work? And we ought to know more about that labour, and that is a sort of more or less hidden history. But then the other is the aesthetic genre conventions that have grown up that allow these people to have such total confidence in knowing what makes that colour image work without,
It is also interesting that you chose this particular image, in a way repurposing that image which was hand colorized and then in your own book cover. So we see the afterlife of this one image, which was probably originally in some other colors altogether, then pictured and then colored in some other ways, and then takes the shape of a book cover.
Oh, it's had a lot of afterlives. It was in a Tate Modern show just last year about
Right.
photography in the 80s. So, it's. I mean, that's why I thought it brought all those themes together. Why it seemed like the object to choose from which to talk about all these different issues. Yeah.
Well, the question of recolorizing is very interesting because, I mean, one doesn't want to be a didact and say that, please don't do this, you know, these are black and white films, please don't. But on the other hand, I think like that question is futile because the archive has been made available online and the whole point is for people to access it and to do what they wish with it.
Exactly.
And I think that is the only way to make it relevant. Otherwise, why should we care about the state archive that, you know, omitted like so many marginalized histories or, you know, presented the nation as this one image? You know, why should we care about it? The fact is that whether its continued relevance matters, and it will only matter when people kind of meddle with it. You know, where they like do something with it. And I think as much as it exhausts me to think about this vlogger and, you know, what they did, and I made a video essay on it, which was a reaction because I couldn't find any other scholarly way to engage with this material, and then I realized that all I need to do is to react. So I did, and I wrote these 2 letters in the video essay to, you know, say that, okay, let me give you a history lesson, because you need one. First of all, it's not a video, it's a film. You know, there's a way in which, but then I realized quickly that that wasn't leading me anywhere. So I did like a second part of that letter, which was actually to understand what, you know, what happens to the archival object when it leaves the archive, right? That's the question I wanted us to also think about. And I think what happens is that it goes out of control, that recolorizing will happen because people do want to engage with moving images in the way they like. And the question then is, what do we do with it? What does that do to the aesthetic of the image? What does that do to the indexicality of the photographic image, to the people who are captured in this, to the backgrounds, you know, to the skin color, like what's going on there? I think those are then questions. At the same time, then we have to kind of tie it up to the larger histories of practices of remix, you know, that have always had this kind of irreverent disposition with the archive, and I think that is probably also a political way to deal with it. So even if like this one example doesn't do it, I was just looking at all the examples of Bombay films, like Bombay cinema films that are available in color online, and I was just thinking like, you know, the labs that have done that and how much AI will change everything. I think that idea of the doctored image and all of those things are just like, we need to find new terms to deal with these issues, just like people have found new terms to deal with black and white image, which is that it's a desaturated image. It's like, oh, it's shot on film, black and white film, what do you mean desaturated? But that's how people refer to it. So I think, how do we then kind of take those terms as critical kind of and do a critical history, thinking those terms as telling us something about the present and the past together. Anyway, sorry, it's not very coherent, but that's what
No, but it's also a history of dealing with precarious archives in the current context, where the archives that Ritika and we are studying, some of them have been merged in a more corporate conglomerate setup, and the risk of actually accessing and finding a lot of those archives is increasing. So how do you see your method of meddling in the context of that, and for that matter, this recolorizing in that context?
Yeah, well, that's a big question.
As
right?
an afterlife, yeah.
Well, that's the question, like, because, let's see. Well, color is not something that I paid any attention to be honest, before I was invited to this conference, and I'm like, oh, color, yeah, it matters. But this recent observation of the Shastri films reusing colored film as black and white, in black and white film. So, you know, it's a cheaper way to produce it, and I hadn't noticed like how many of those shots were originally from color films, like India 67, which was shot in Eastman color, and then So there are shots from it that featured in like 10 different FD films. I think it changes the way we can think of like closely analyzing one film, like Manishita was saying. We need to think about methods that take us beyond one film and look at the archive as a whole and see like what's, not as a whole, it's not a complete thing, but basically tracking like these networks and connections. And so one of my long-term projects is to actually catalog how do these shots from particular films end up in different kinds of films as this kind of found footage and archival objects, and what happens to their original context. Like sometimes, so one of the video essays that you mentioned about meddling, shots from a film shot in 1967 make its way to a 1975 film, and shows the progress that women have made in the country, but those shots are from like 7-8 years ago. So they are not in color, but I think that's the kind of methodology that I would be interested in personally, to think with these, and then see like when does an image go from color or black and white to other things. And
Yeah, I think, as you said, Manishita pointing out that absence can be a generative force in thinking of archives and methods is a very important point. But Manishita, I was also interested in your work in Tasveer Ghar. And you've been a scholar dealing with early cinema, but you've also worked as someone who's looked into preservation of these posters and calendar art and these ephemera sort of resources. So in any way did that sort of impact in how you thought or sort of looked or sort of experienced color, not just as a scholar but also someone who's now looking to preserve it, changing the gears? Did that sort of...
I think it did. Both my scholarly work and because I would pay attention to I did end up paying more. This was around the same time when I was doing research for Outside the Lettered City, so I did end up paying much more attention to ephemera than I had originally intended to. So that did have that impact. And yes, it did make me aware of these issues around preservation, but also dissemination. And one of the things that Tasveer Ghar, so I wasn't really involved with the technical side of it. So we had this Yusuf Saeed, who was based in Delhi, that he was kind of the, technical, creative sort of force behind the project. And then Sumati Ramasamy, who was then at Michigan. I was also at Michigan at that point, and Christian Brosias, who was at Heidelberg. So we were part of the kind of team. So the discussions about kind of preservation, dissemination did have an impact, and it did make me start thinking about it. But the other thing was also we were successful in persuading scholars like Ranjini and Sabina and many others.
Rosie too.
And Rosie, actually, yes. It's been a while, so I've been blanking out in the names. And many others, actually, to write this really wonderful pieces. They could choose whatever objects they wanted to write about from that archive and write these pieces which were, absolutely very rich in terms of scholarly insights, but which were written for a much wider audience. So kind of thinking about that as well. So going back to afterlives of to what extent can we ensure even certain kinds of afterlives for archival objects? So yes.
Yeah. All right, so I'm now going to open up the conversation to you all, and just get the mic. So. Right, we'll start with Sarah and then we'll come to Ranjini.
Thank you, that was all fascinating. I've got a question for Manishita, really. It's about whether the equivalent of press books, because press books in the UK and US were sort of organised by distributors in intersection with exhibitors, and they were really advising on how best to promote the films and how to show them and to have practices around that would encourage its audiences to sort of take particular note of particular facets of the films. But you were mentioning these as like souvenir booklets, so were they the equivalent of press books, and were the ones that you've looked at more intended for sort of fans and audiences, and what are the problems around tracing what was done with them and who saw them?
Yeah, and there was a dense network of distributors, exhibitors, studios who were involved in the production of these. So I don't think there was one standardized model. And there could be people in the room who know much more about the song booklets than I do. So I think they were a cross between, they started out, I think, as press books, but they became I think, the people involved in producing them very quickly figured out there was a market for these books, and then they became much more geared towards the viewers, potential and actual viewers. So they would be sold as souvenirs of your movie-going experience, or sometimes not even of your movie-going experience. People would buy and collect these booklets, even if they hadn't seen the films. And so a lot of people would actually experience films they haven't seen through these images. So their experience of the films would be in color, in part. There are a couple of really interesting essays, one by Usha Iyer, which came out in JCMS, on song booklets, and one by Madhuja Mukherjee in an edited volume. I'm blanking out on the title, but I can send the references to you. And that particular essay, Madhuja's essay, looks at this networks of distributors, exhibitors, printing presses in Calcutta that were involved in the production of these. And of course, there were huge regional variations, but also one thing I didn't mention, these booklets were meant for multilingual audiences. So the song lyrics, which were a major attraction of the booklets, would be in Hindi, Urdu, sometimes in Bengali, English, Gujarati also, I think. I'm thinking of the languages I've encountered, and I'm sure other languages as well.
So thanks very much. That was a really interesting panel. And as Poorvi said, everything really came together very well for the three of you. I just want to respond first to Rosie's point about Jung Lee and why was they shooting black and white photographs. So I actually have the answer for that.
Oh yeah.
Because I met the photographer who shot all the stills, and the Kamat Photo Flash, which is a family-owned enterprise, and they were taking all the stills on these film sets. So it was started by a grandfather, and then you have the grandson. So I spoke to the grandson, and he said that print media continued to be black and white. So for publicity, they needed black and white stills. And so we had to take black and white photographs for the black and white print media, print culture. But they fixed a pedestal for two cameras soon after Jung Lee. One was taking black and white photos, the second was taking color photos, because the color photos were given to the more expensive elite magazines where color photographs were used. And Jung Lee didn't start off being a big hit because in the sense that they didn't know it was going to be the money spinner of that decade. It became that, and then of course things started to change. But this was what was happening, because we have to remember the print media, newspapers, magazines, etc. were still black and white, and that's why they needed that print culture. And this is going to be in the oral history part, because I have done an interview with the family, the granddaughter and the son, so that may answer some of what you were raising. The second question I had was for Ritika, which was really interesting, because as someone who's interested in technology and memory, I found it very interesting because the whole history of cybernetics is also geared around this question of how memory was mediated by or worked through the technological. So, Jamie Barron makes a very interesting argument in her archive effect that the readers of history have become the users of history. So the archival afterlife of all these objects is now how we use them and what we do to them. And this changes the way in which we think about the past. And in some senses, everything requires a trigger. The arrival of color was a trigger to think about what we considered the past differently. And today too, the digital is so much about the past. It's not really, AI is maybe projecting the future, But most people online are actually thinking about this past, and they have access to this kind of material. So it raises very interesting questions about the relationship between the past, history, and memory, and how do we then think about the archival afterlife. So this just a response, you can respond. Thanks.
Okay, we get Nasreen first.
As usual, very interesting. A little point, guys, I think that what you showed us was a booklet, which is actually not for sale. They were given out. The song books were sold.
That was a song booklet. I have the entire copy. Yeah,
Okay.
entire copy.
I got confused because I had that brochure. That little booklet. So I wasn't sure that they
It was a
were
song
sold.
booklet.
These the ones that were brochures, were they sold?
The song booklets were sold. So this was a song booklet. I have the entire copy. I just
And you got the other version as well? Which was
I don't have the other
synopsis.
version. I have the song booklet version in its
Because
entirety.
the other one was with the synopsis in English,
Yeah.
Hindi and Urdu, and the songs usually in Urdu and Hindi only. But most interesting was the cast and the crew, where it was printed, which lab, and all that information was very good. I wanted to talk to you about one thing is, I thought it was very interesting, because whatever we may say, the past is not coming back. So what are we doing with it? And what you've shown here is what the young generation are doing it. We have access to so much technology that all this is possible without any expense. I mean, maybe in the 50s people would have loved to do this, but it costs too much to go to a lab and get it all colored or whatever. So this is very interesting of how economically they can actually access the archive. And what is archived today? And what is going to be preserved for the future is a big question, very big question. In terms of the archive, Mr. Ujjwal has already told us about all the restoration and all the various things that are happening. What I think is really kind of missing is what Ranjini pointed out, is that there aren't enough really interviews with GOPs and technicians. There's just not enough of that. And through your organization, I'm sure it would really help to document more of that. I'm sure it will happen. And basically, it's appealing when you mentioned people referring to the old into the new. I cannot remember, but I saw in the 80s or something, I think it was a Moroccan or an Algerian film, in which they show a clip of Anne, and all the audience were Algerians or Moroccans, were clapping away when they saw Dilip Kumar, and it was a color clip, and it was a fantastic scene in this Moroccan or Algerian movie, which they go to the cinema and they watch Anne, because all of you may know that Anne was a big hit everywhere. There was a Tamil version as well, and it was a big hit everywhere, and it was called Mangala, Daughter of India. And I met the distributor, who was a Frenchman in Paris, and he said to me, I said, who's Mangala? I didn't even figure out. He said, Mimi's character was called Mangala, and he liked her, he didn't like the princess. So he called me Mangala, Daughter of India. And that film as well, you have to see that it was distributed in London, and everybody or people who have worked on it know that it ran for 12 weeks. It's the only Indian film, I think, that ran for 12 weeks in the Rialto, which is a mainstream cinema, in 1952. And there was a contract between Alexander Korda and Menusa, and it's Korda who distributed it. So, I mean, we're not totally reinventing the wheel. It's been turning. And Anne is a very, very interesting example of colorization. Not only that he made a black and white film, but I don't think that film exists, print, but the whole process, the Technicolor, the blowing up. We didn't talk enough about how 16mm to 35 was blown up. All of these things, the technology in 1951, was very advanced, hugely advanced. Many more risks than today. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Also, thanks, Nasri. I think you just explained why. I was really baffled by seeing a poster for Arm on the back wall of a Givet get photographic sales office in Java, but that is probably why. Thank you all so much. This was such a fab and like really kind of connected discussion. My question is kind of for Rosie, but also connects with things that Manishita has written on previously about modernity, and it's really about this hand colouring, right? So thank you. You've also made sense of some images I saw in the Cinematheque Toulouse, which were hand-coloured black and white images from Jean Renoir's The River, which was shot in 3D Technicolor in India, and I couldn't work out why these hand-coloured, right? Because they're shot in Technicolor, which is presumably to market them domestically in India or to kind of replicate the aesthetic of kind of Indian marketing materials. I also wanted to kind of flag the image on our little symposium booklet, which is from Durgesh Nardini from 1956, which was shot in Technicolor but is hand-coloured, right? I raise this because I think probably to Josh, this might look like European American cinema of the late 19th century in terms of its aesthetic. And so this is a long-winded question about questions of technology, modernity and delay, which was some of the keywords from the first roundtable discussion, of thinking about this process of hand colouring, which in cinemas of Europe and Hollywood is kind of an early film technology, right, that has this much longer life in Bombay and the Indian film industry. So how do we speak about this without kind of lapsing into an idea of kind of belated modernity, which is something Manishita's written about? And I just kind of be interested to hear you kind of reflect on that, the use of this technology that has its own aesthetic, that doesn't reproduce an idea of kind of the delay of kind of colour negative or shooting direct to colour in the way we speak about it. And that's not because you were speaking about it in that way, it's something I'm grappling with in my work, so I'd love to hear you reflect on that, and Manishita as well.
Yeah. I mean, Sudhir Mahadevan is probably the best resource for that, a very old machine, who talks about the coexistence in India of these different forms. So you don't talk about delay, it's all, things are repurposed in different ways. And I think quite a lot has to do with this notion of these very different circuits. So the C-grade circuits, which were the out-of-town small places, got a repurposed old technology, and the A-grade circuits got something very different. So at every level, just and I think it's just the complexity of the Indian film industry that has probably far more levels and different forms of things in circulation. And of course, the original bioscopes, repurposed, were still doing travelling cinema in the sort of early 2000s. So it's probably not surprising that the hand colouring continued in that kind of way. One thing that also occurred to me, though, was I don't know why I'd forgotten about Come Out. Of course, I went to Come Out a lot, and I'd forgotten that there was all that. But Pamposh, the stills are in black and white, the colour film.
Right, yes.
So I think, one's always talking about a productive mix, but different levels and layers, which makes saying anything about India very difficult. And that has always been the case.
And similarly, I think I like to think of it as repurposing, or to borrow a term from Ritika, the remix aesthetic of not just the films, but the publicity that you see in the publicity material. So if you do a close textual analysis of some of the publicity material and kind of try to trace the visual cultural references, they're very local. There's a mix of local, regional, very transnational kind of references, and a mix of a very sort of, almost a very kind of, I don't want to say irreverent, but but also irreverent, confident remixing of aesthetics and techniques, some of which are very contemporary, some of which are much older. So I think that's my way of dealing with that kind of the belatedness sort of issue.
Yes.
Thanks, it's a really fascinating discussion. I've got two comments to make and then I've got a question, principally for Rosie, but for other people present. So the first thing is my own research in Bombay talkies. I've got all the song booklets digitised, and that was already from 1935, and they followed the format that Nasreen has mentioned, that they explained the text of the film, and they had the song lyrics, usually in Hindi, relatively sometimes English, but it was also they said who was involved in the film. The second comment is the comment about Morocco. Well, I lived there for a year, and just walking around, you find people like Charlotte Khan on posters advertising all sorts of things, from barbers to whatever it might be. The third, my question is, it relates to hand colouring. And I'm coming from the perspective of animated art and hand colouring. And in Germany, in the studios when they hand coloured the animated art, it was definitely a female occupation on the basis that women have small, delicate hands. Now, do you know anything about, was it mixed gender in the work you have done in India?
No, I'm sure it was men.
It was men.
Yeah.
That's actually a very interesting segue because in the research that I'm doing as well, I'm looking at animation and color, and I did come across someone, a wife of an animator who was coloring these cells for him at home.
With their fingers were better.
Sorry?
Women manage their fingers much better. So that's why they were always used for that.
Yeah, for the painstaking stuff. Yeah.
Okay, hi, it is time. Thank you for a really fun panel. Questions and speculation, at the level of speculation. Okay, very with Ritika. And then I have something that, actually I'll do the Rosie and then I'll do the speculation. Okay, Rosie and Manishita. So it felt, because you both have done, especially I know Rosie's work in this front, the other work, your other shadow work, which I'm interested in, is that we are actually dealing with the question of the photographic studio.
Sorry, I can't hear you.
Well, I couldn't hear you, Rosie, earlier.
Okay.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes, okay, great. So I said the photographic studio. So that's the other history. We've been dealing so exclusively with cinema and stills, etc. We forgot. And Rosie's work on Pushpa Mala's photographic is a way of rethinking. For you, I'm just sort of putting your work back to you in a way. So it's a way of thinking about film stills, but the photographic, contemporary photographic practices that take on film stills and redo it, right? That's one kind of an artistic practice that's out there. Somebody like me who still loves the finished product and talks about the missing. So this is where Ritika said AI work was so interesting for me, is there are a number of recent films, especially in Tamil cinema, where the return to the photographic still is very big. From Subramaniapuram onwards, they go to the photographic studio, they take photographs of themselves, etc. There is a stilling of image, etc. Right? So there is that. So there's a return to the photographic studio, and I think much of the color was hand painted in the photographic, right? Glass painting, all of that. So anyways, it's a way of sort of saying, hey, that's our other discipline. Our friends in the other discipline are also doing this in a different way. So we don't have to work. It's just that you've already done this work. So in Ritika, I was thinking, having just come from next, and then sort of thinking about this, the AI, you've got the archive, right? And then there's Manishita's interest in absent film, and my interest too, but in a very different conclusions on the absent film. One could just feed a good AI program with a lost film, and then a text to image. So there'd be nothing missing. that would be really sad.
That's scary.
If everything is available now.
But that's what the digital big data debate is about.
Exactly.
They're promising us that total knowledge.
Absolutely. No, but that is, I mean, it's stuff, it's completely, absolutely, this is what I mean. So you can feed anything, and then we're going to have this endlessly, like, oh, what are the color films? So that's one. The other weird part we think, which since Ujjwal is here, that we think that the black and white processing is stable, which it isn't. So there's another, you can have so many, you can have print 1, print 2, print 3, numbers run on everything. Right? This is just a reminder, that's all. You don't even have to respond, but I was thinking of people like Archana Hegde, who works on sort of holograms, Pushpa Mala, who's been, so in a way that's the side discipline. You don't have to, but you're right, this is the AI, this is back to the question of the speculative, right? So you won't have any film. In fact, you'll have an entire new archive. I mean, that's a horror of the
I think that really speaks to the problem of the, I think it really speaks to the problem of the abundance.
Yeah.
And abundant archives don't necessarily make for more knowledge.
Exactly.
Because sometimes hidden, like, when I was looking at FD's records, which were available in an abundance that was beyond my capacity to physically go through them, or beyond the capacity of them to actually archive that material, which they did not, you realize, like, actually what we are dealing with is like this little, sliver of what Vern Harris calls a sliver of an archive, that we are only dealing with those slivers. We are actually never dealing with an archive. So this imagination that AI can be fed the 8,000 films that Films Division made and will produce something that will be more, it won't be, because it will actually reproduce the absences that were in those films and actually multiply them many times over. So then our job is, and Sudhir Mahadevan's work on the abundant ephemeral is also about that, this kind of revisioning of using the ephemera to make more kinds of different kinds of alternative histories, rather than thinking of history as this one thing. Or
the myth of total recovery.
I think that, exactly. So that myth of so it's definitely a myth, and I am so skeptical about AI, but not in terms of this imagination of the total kind of archive, but more also interested in like how we can use it to create these something else that probably doesn't exist, or probably, I don't know, but I haven't used it. But a lot of video essayists are now using AI to, and I also thought that maybe I can feed it some images and then see what it reproduces, or what kind of, so there's this famous quote by James Beveridge that says, India's story is there on film, looking at the Films Division archive. And I was thinking, like, what is that story? Let's have AI actually tell us what that story is if we were to feed it. But anyway, that is just to say that those binaries of abundance and loss and recovery and those kinds of things, I think we need to shuffle them and realize that actually they're not as binary as we thought they were. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for that. Also, thanks, Ritika, for allowing an interloper from photography to kind of enter the discussion. I've been really afraid of speaking up, but I did really find there was this kind of ghost of Indian photography in all of your papers. It was really interesting. And so I have a couple of questions broadly. One is structural or to do with the industry. I'm really interested in whether people who are involved in Bohra Color, for example, Rosie, were also working on overpainting, and I wonder if, I know Judith Mara Gathman went to India in the 80s and was doing research on hand-painted images, but I wondered if we know of any kind of industrial connection between people who are working in kind of hand-painted photography in Bombay, and then also people working in film, because I would imagine that there might be some kind of points of connection there. Ritika, I was really interested in this question of color and proximity, and obviously this is something that's happening in photography a lot as well. You get these kind of social media pages where people are recoloring digitally early photographs from the mid to late 19th century and saying, but it makes it so close to you, right? And I'm really interested in this question of color and proximity, especially when it comes then to the film division and the way that this kind of color and proximity is the latest stage in a kind of sedimented nostalgia for these people, right? And so Sama and Subramaniam's article back then is 2015.
we're now, 10 years later, sorry, losing track of this hellscape we live in. But 10 years later, we've got a bunch of scholarship. You're writing on it. I imagine IM20 receives quite a lot of critical scholarship. People haven't gone back to find the students from Yes, It's On.
Yeah.
To my knowledge, right?
Yeah.
So I'm interested in why it's kind of, this film captures so much of our kind of imagination, and you're writing about nostalgia. So 2 questions for you, if I may. One, were there reactions? Were there reactions to your film? Or were there comments? Because I think that my theory about this is that there's a lot of questions about people being too cerebral about images, and so often in the kind of Victorian photography pages that have been recolorized, you get you get the kind of someone from university saying, this image is supposed to be black and white, why are we recolorizing? Why are we saturating it? What is the point of this? And then people saying, oh, you're thinking too much or whatever. So I wondered if there was something similar that had happened for you, or what the kind of responses have been. But also, I guess a question about, for me, it strikes me that public history in India is now a really contested space politically, and it's obviously very challenging to enter that space. It's very challenging to voice opinions in that space, and I find the nostalgia for IM20 kind of jarring in that it so actively represents, primarily shot in IIT Bombay, mostly these Anglophone elites. I kind of want to slap a few of them. For being so kind of eloquent and loquacious, as one of them says. And I'm really interested in what you think about that, how you think IM20 kind of occupies that space.
Okay, so that difference between, why IM20 keeps capturing the imagination of younger and younger generations of people.
Whose imagination? I'm curious.
Well, the entire internet, apparently.
Really?
Every year on Republic Day or Independence Day, people are like, this gem from 1967,
I see.
this time capsule, this film, and people are like, wow, they're speaking such good English.
Yeah, totally.
So when Saman Subramaniam does the research on who are the people in this film and tries to interview them and wants to interview the face of the film, which was this IIT T.N. Subramaniam, who sadly passed away before anybody could interview him. But he left the country. In the film, he says that I want to go see India in all its colors and all its versions, whatever, and I want to travel around the country, and then it has this beautiful montage of different aspects of the country, and on for this dream that people's imaginations are being captured by, right? It's a contradiction, right? It's what you see in the film is not necessarily who they became. They turn into completely different people as they grew up, and some of them remain activists, but some of them, were mathematicians or scientists or whatever. But what's interesting to me, though, is this idea of why people think that they can relate to them as if they are speaking to them now. And I think part of it is the country's political situation. People kept saying on the comments, nothing has changed. People are still, the disillusionment is more and more. The person who's probably making that video is 20 years old or something like that. So they relate to the 20-year-olds in the film because it is like an indexical record. No matter how elitist, no matter 80% of them are from IIT Bombay, they do represent 20-year-olds who were born with India when it became independent. So there is that aspect to it, which I think just captures people's minds. On the other hand, what I talk about in that video is, what about the people who we cannot track in the film? So there are these women who talk about how she married at the age of 8 and then had so many kids, and all she remembers about her wedding is the food she ate. So who's going to track them, right? How do the archive presents you with a dead end? There is no way to trace them because their names are not mentioned. They are not famous people whose photos we can, who will recognize them in newspapers if their photo was published, which is how one person actually came out and said that that's me in that picture, one of the women in the films. So I think it really, then again, our methodologies need to be different, right? I mean, because if we only look at what the archive is presenting to us, we'll completely miss the point. And I think Shastri was very conscious of that, and that is why he interviewed those people, who do not belong to these kinds of elite circuits.
And also, in defense of the loquacious cultural
Yes.
elite, they also represent India. We often forget that. They do represent a particular version of India.
Yeah.
Just saying.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly, yeah.
If I could just say one thing,
yes.
the person who wrote, they were very surprised that they speak good English.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He couldn't spell T-H-E-I-R.
Yeah.
Rosie, before I give it over to Ranjini, do you want to respond to Vidya's question?
Sorry?
Do you want to respond to...
Well, I mean, sadly, the answer is I don't know, and so that research needs to be done. One assumes that clearly, the conventions, the visual conventions are similar across those different fields, but I've no idea how much the people related to each other. My suspicion is probably not that much, that people would have a small area of expertise, but they were picking up the conventions from each other. But I don't know.
Let them ask first. It's okay, we have a lot of time. We have half an hour, so...
No?
No, but we have a 15-minute break.
15 minutes.
We have 15.
Sorry.
Perhaps I'm enjoying too much.
Keep going.
Okay, so I want to, this is a provocation.
Yeah.
We are still stuck on the idea of archive as storage. The archive has become about dispersion today.
Yeah.
It's really about accelerated movement of images and material. It's about dispersion. So when you talk about abundance, you're talking about human perception. You're at one level talking about AI, but the machine can read the entire spectrum in a very different kind of way. So we really have to come to terms with this. The archive has changed.
But the archive hasn't changed. The archive has always been dispersed. We just thought about it as a place of storage, and many of us working on pre-1950s Indian film cultures were trying to move past that notion. Again, Sudhir talks about this quite eloquently.
No, it's not storage in that sense, but there was always an attempt to build the archive in terms of a stable institution where, though everything was not available in the institution, it was dispersed in different contexts. But perceptually, how to organize the material and think about it did require us to do the research to access that material. What happens to the writing of the past now when the machine is doing this?
Yeah.
We can't ignore this now.
No, we can't.
This is such a big thing, so we can't talk about abundance as a problem in the writing of the past. Abundance is now, the story of Her, the film that we all saw in 2013. It's really come to be our lives now. In some senses, think about it.
I think we
How
need
much
to
of it
interrogate the
has
notion of
been
abundance, not dismiss it, but try to engage with that particular notion of abundance and think about what, if anything, we bring into it that a machine can't.
I think it's
Maybe
also
nothing.
this
I don't have
imagination.
an answer to this, but
Yeah,
I think
neither
there's
do I.
definitely something new that we have to reckon with.
Yeah.
It's not an easy situation, but it is definitely something we have to.
In fact, very quickly, Ranjini, I don't know, you might have seen this. There was a really interesting article in the New York Times about history being written by AI reading huge amounts of data and what kind of histories come out of that. So, yeah.
Do you know, any of you know, where they get the reels from? Some of those very rare footage that you find on Instagram.
That's true.
From these films.
No, but where are they projecting it from? I mean, how are they getting access
No,
to
they
it?
are only accessing the ones that have been digitized.
Which on YouTube?
I mean, first of all, not everything has been digitized, not everything has been uploaded to YouTube, which I think also speaks to the question that you were asking, Ranjini. Because I think we have this imagination that everything has been digitized, there is no need for physical archives, there is no need to keep the original negatives of the films because we have digitized them. And, so there is complete misperception about what archiving is. And this is a misperception that, a few years ago when they merged the films division into the NFDC, this person wanted to ask me about, what is the importance of this archive? And I was like, Okay, where do I begin? It's a very difficult question to answer to someone who understands like the preservation or archiving as digitization and it ends there. So the problem is it's so hard to get some of the films that look terrible because they made this like digital version that looks terrible now, and then there is no way to get another version remade because nobody is interested in doing that. They did that once, and then it's not at all like of concern. So I think first of all we need to disengage that everything has been preserved and made available. It hasn't. The archives I looked at have been destroyed. They are gone. Or if not destroyed, they're lying somewhere where we don't know where they are, right? So it's like there is no recovering them. There is no like digital footprint of them available. So we're already dealing with like these kinds of issues. Then also like so many of the things are actually not digitized. Like I think if we only looked at digitized archives, we would be looking at a very limited narrative of
I
history.
think some of these archives, if I might even use the term, I don't know, I mean, for lack of a better term, some of these collections that we look at emerge through happenstance, right? I mean, serendipity has a big role to play in it.
But I just don't know technically where are they getting these clips from. That's what I want to know.
Well, so what
Origin story. That's an origin story.
Yeah, but I think
Phil had a question and then
some of the clips that are in India 67, are in IM20. I have seen them in like Insta reels that are just like, oh, in the 1950s there was this room for people to have alcohol in, and then suddenly it shows like an image of a woman from IM20 in that film without any reference, without anything. So because I think like they think, okay, where can I get an image of, and they're like, okay, well, maybe I'll look at some films division reels and then take like, an image out of that and make another reel. So I think maybe that answers that question. That because there's this film called
One last question before we end this panel. Do you want to?
Thanks so much. It's interesting. I guess I'm coming from a slightly different perspective as a filmmaker who's worked quite a lot with archive and constantly presented with the problem of the absence of archive, which is something other post-colonial filmmakers, I think. I mean, I don't even know if the term post-colonial stands for these, but I was recently in conversation with Raoul Beck, and he talked about how we just don't have archives because of the power structures we inherit. And in relation to that, I'm just very aware that we're talking, when you're talking about IM20, you're talking about Midnight's Children, and when you're talking about Midnight's Children, you're also talking about the absent archive, which is the archive that doesn't really exist for Pakistan and Bangladesh, right? I think it's difficult to have a conversation around Bombay film color or archives related to Bombay. They don't really imagine or think about like the kind of liminal archives that don't exist for like the Pan-South Asian region, and the stories that we can possibly never tell because these films don't exist. And I was wondering if you could maybe talk a bit more about that for us.
should we collect some questions because there were more hands rather than us?
So that's
okay.
the last question we can
Okay.
We've got 5 minutes, so we could like.
So rather than responding, collect questions and then
Just about to get good.
Don't do the question.
Sorry.
I think Phil had one as well, so we could
I've already asked a couple.
do a little montage.
Sorry, who had a question to ask?
Yeah, go ahead, ask it.
And Phil as well, and then
Thank you. So I had a question for Rosie. Partially, your talk reminded me of this film called Photo Walas by David Jewels McDougall, and how it speaks about photographers at stations and global photographers at stations. And, they kind of talk about how they prefer black and white because there's more art to it, and sort of they hand color images, and that's part of the skill in this Spanish color photography. And I was just wondering if that's kind of, we can think of that as some sort of an industrial relationship where actually, like you currently spoke about print, but also there's a way in which taking black and white photography allows for a certain kind of local business structure to exist. And that, like, rather than seeing as sort of a, elite versus more general public or high class versus low class, but actually that we can see the film industry's use of black and white photography precisely proliferating a certain kind of local photography culture. And sort of hand coloring culture, which doesn't even directly connect with cinema, but kind of exists more broadly. Yeah, I was just curious about that.
Do we have any other questions?
Phil.
Well, it's more sort of a couple of observations. There's so much to unpack here. It's so interesting. I just wanted to say two things. I'm very glad the person in the back who asked the question about politics of archival policy. I mean, if you guys have access to the entire archive, you are very, very fortunate. The Russians, I can tell you, they're virtually impossible to get hold of materials, apart from stuff that's been uploaded from within the film industry itself and within television, often illegally, often outside copyright law, except Russia's relationship with copyright law is not exactly great. So for me, also, AI is not really in a position yet to analyse moving visual material. It has enough photographs and paintings, let alone visual material. So I don't think that history is ever going to be written by AI for the time being. My observation about hand painting of images, I think this is a really, really interesting subject with a long history in the history of photography. So hand painting of lantern slides, etc., etc. On the part of travellers, largely European, North American, who go to exotic countries, places like India, places like Japan, etc., 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 it's as if their black and white images of these exotic lands are insufficient to earn them as sort of speaking to us, so they colorise them. But what's interesting about what you were talking about today is about the colorisation from within the culture itself. And my question, and I guess it's a research question, will be about the particular colour sensitivity and sensibility on the part of peoples, nations, regions, ethnicities within those regions, and the degree to which they can be described as idiosyncratic based on cultural artistic heritage. Because from what I've seen from the image you showed today, these are very different from the sorts of colorising conventions that you encounter, say, in the 1920s and 1930s. People going to the Soviet Union, taking black and white lantern slides, coming back to North America, getting artists to hand paint them who have never been to the Soviet Union. And some of the same images are painted differently by different artists, almost absurdly. But you're dealing with a very different aesthetic sensibility in the example that you gave us. So I'm in terms of Bombay colour, and in terms of how colour is used in India, I'd be very interested to explore that. Well, it would be nice to see some sense in which there's a particular approach to the use of colour, not just about technology, but about aesthetics.
Any other questions?
No, that wasn't a question, it was an observation.
I think Eleanor.
There's somebody else in the back if we have time.
Tiny comment, you don't need to have the microphone, but doing my own research in India on the Bombay talkies, the films weren't readily available. And when I was in Pune, I was told that I needed to go to this back street shop just off the main road. And that was so I got a load of CDs of the early Bombay talkies films made for me. And they took a few days because they were coming from different sources. And this was very much the informal archives where guys with huge sort of devices just recorded film after film, film after film, sometimes off the TV, not in very good quality, but it enabled me as a researcher to actually see the films. And so I just wanted to bring in the informal archives, which were also just mentioned for us. So,
If I could make just one comment, for some people, Atul Dodia, a very well-known Indian artist, has been taking screen grabs of black and white films and making paintings himself. That's an interesting example. Plus, I've never matched, I don't know whether ever you have, he did one screen grab of Anand, which is a colour film. I don't have the answer, but did he replicate the original colour from the film, or was it his version? That would be interesting to know. I don't know what he did.
Yeah.
You did a series of these, right?
Yes.
It was screen grabs, strong screen grabs.
My sense is that, given in that show there was a a kind of colour palette that went through the whole show. I'm sure they were his colours, not theirs.
Absolutely
It
right.
was, yeah, I mean, that's a very, very good example.
Yeah, blues and pinks.
Yes, pinks and turquoises, and yeah. Just an interesting comment. I mean, thank you for that. The fact that Europeans were hand colouring exotica, I think the sets of the kinds of black and white images that stand out to me that were most hand colours, and I haven't done any proper research on this, is the fantasy films, which were quasi-Arabian Nights. So, and certainly the Wadias who were making these fantasy films, like Aladdin, Ali Baba, those were the films that in the 50s had reels hand-coloured. And that would be definitely about it, a sort of exotic.
And I think there's a lot of work in art history, on photography, on popular print cultures, where I think the question you asked about localized aesthetic color sensibilities, which are never that localized. It's kind of marked by a remix aesthetic, but I think that kind of a conversation needs to take place.
All right, so perhaps we can take this opportunity to continue these conversations we've started and build on them through this project and hopefully after. Please join me in thanking our brilliant panelists. Such a lovely audience with so many questions, keeping the conversation really strong and lively. I think we'll break for another 15 minutes.